Every 7 years, research at IHE Delft is reviewed by an external committee, a committee that follows the guidelines of the Netherlands Academy of Sciences. And our last review, evaluation, was in 2021. And while the review was generally very positive, it did include the following sentence. Based on its written mission and ambition, IHE Delft could be critiqued for implicit ideas of neo-colonial superiority, coupled with ideas that development is a unilinear evolutionary process. Yeah? So the evaluation committee acknowledged that in their conversations with us and their conversations with our PhD candidates and the like, they didn't necessarily see this coming through, but they still advised us, these are not their exact words, but they suggested that we take concrete steps to decolonize our practices, to see our research, teaching, and learning as equitable partnerships based on mutual capacity facilitation. And there was a few more phrasings of just how we could benefit as an institution from beginning to follow this path of decolonization. Now, this was an evaluation that involved us and a number of universities. Some of the universities received similar critiques. Some of them reacted quite harshly to it. They fought back and denied. But we as an institute, that its fundamental mission is to collaborate with so many corners of the world, we took the blow and we really tried to respond. Yeah? And it initiated a discussion inside the institution. It's a learning process that continues. But we did initiate a number of actions within our staff, in our teaching programs, in our master's program. There is the content is included, and in our PhD program, because we especially wanted to ensure it's about all of us, but young researchers, PhD candidates coming into the institution, embarking on that highest level of academic achievement, the PhD, with a focus on research. We wanted to ensure that hopefully all of them had an opportunity to learn, to experience, to have time to internalize what was being communicated, by this message of decolonize. And we also wanted to ensure that whether you were just doing detailed hydraulic modeling in a short section of river, or working with indigenous cultures somewhere in the world, that you recognize that we all somehow are connected and influenced by, and our own even mathematical methodologies, there's still some essence of this in it. And it also, learning about the topic just opens your mind, and it makes you appreciate as well so much the partners that we work with, and hopefully collaborating with them and interacting with them in different ways. So you can imagine early on in this process, now 3 years ago, I was thrilled when Amitangshu agreed to take on this task of developing a PhD course on the topic. We were very grateful at the time as well to the Water and Development Partnership Program that's tried to imbue, to include this in their own products, that they were willing to support the development of the course. So now we're in the third session, and can I see a hand from the participants in the course in the room? And those of you who are not, you can see we have some of our own PhD candidates and also PhD candidates from many other universities and some that have traveled from other countries. So what you are drawing in, Amitangshu, and also just having you here is enriching our experience and the experience of our PhD candidates as well. We've learned a lot from a number of people along this journey, and we're very fortunate today to have Sundar Sarukkai with us, to speak. So Sundar works primarily in the philosophy of the natural and social sciences. He's held positions of professor of philosophy at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, founder-director of the Manipal Center of Philosophy and Humanities, and visiting faculty at the Center for Society and Policy and the Indian Institute, or within the Indian Institute of Science. And Sundar doesn't, like me, enjoy when someone reads a long list of their accomplishments. It could go on for much, much more, including multiple books that he's written as an author. But I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to just mention that he's currently the founder of Barefoot Philosophers, which is an initiative, it's an NGO, and he runs the place to take philosophy to children and the public. So Sundar, we're grateful that you could be with us today. We're grateful that you can help us as we continue along this pathway. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great pleasure and honor to visit this institute, of which I've heard a lot of, and to be part of this cohort of this workshop on people who have come from different backgrounds, from different experiences, thinking together on this idea of decoloniality. I come from multidisciplinary backgrounds myself, and the question of decolonization has been at one level very important for us. But at another level, we also realize that there's been a lot of resistance to this idea. So I want to begin by pointing out that when I talk about decoloniality from, let's say, the larger lens of history and philosophy of science, I am not referring to colonialism as much as to a simple formulation of what is knowledge. Who has the claims to define knowledge? Are there different knowledge systems? Would we want to look at these different knowledges of different kinds of domains? Do people have knowledge? Do communities have knowledge? Can we have different knowledge of the universe, of how things happen in the world? It is just basically a claim of whether the idea of knowledge can be democratized. That's all. But within that, we need to understand the historical trajectory because of which has made knowledge a kind of a hierarchical value. And it is that exercise I want to do here in order to understand the strengths of a scientific imagination in democratizing the access to knowledge, as well as the inherent problem of knowledge and its relationship to power, which in principle makes us believe that if I have knowledge, then I am the one who is right. And that the difficulty of acknowledging that there can be different ways of looking at the world and different knowledges which we could all share is driven by a very long history of philosophical thought, the way it has defined the idea of knowledge. So I want to begin with the basic point that decolonization in principle, decolonization in science, the call to decolonize, should have been straightforward. It should not be seen as a furtive act in the margins of disciplines in institutions like in the social science and humanities. But you will not see decolonization talk within the Department of Sciences, within the Department of Engineering, for various reasons. And part of it is not just about decolonization, but also about the inability to understand larger meaning of science from the perspectives of history of science, philosophy of science, and sociology of science, all of which constitutes what we call as science studies. So there are many reasons why the decolonization project suffers, but one of the greatest difficulty in the decolonization, in legitimizing this project of decolonizing science, has been the resistance in allowing other imaginations of science. There are many claimants to the title of science. Today we have a proliferation of hundreds of disciplines which call themselves as science. Social science, food science, water science, management science, and so on. And all of them are allowed the use of the word title, the title science, under certain conditions, under certain kinds of uniformity with what constitutes the imagination of science. But when it comes to other kinds of cultural knowledge systems, loosely called as non-Western knowledge systems, there is a particular resistance to this possibility that other communities would have possessed and do possess the capacity to produce knowledge of certain kinds. Why did this come about? How did this come about? And what does one do with it in today? And that's largely the rough idea of what I want to talk about. So the first step in doing this is to decolonize the imagination of science. So if I begin by asking what is it to decolonize science, and if I want to look at the first common example which many of you would have heard of, which is that there are other examples of other knowledge systems, particularly in medical systems across the world. Every community across the world has its own knowledge systems on what it means to treat illness, what it means to live a healthy life, what is a healthy body, and so on. Now, are they all to be seen as medical science? Should they be seen as a science? Should they be seen as a valid knowledge system which others can learn from and duplicate? What is the stake in calling them as knowledge? So this has been one of the major questions about how do you validate other knowledge systems dealing with medical, dealing with society, then knowledge about society, knowledge about individuals, and so on. Which kind of knowledge gets legitimized for the larger global world? Now, much of this resistance, as I said, is based not because of certain kinds of empirical facts about science, but it's based because there is a particular imagination of science, an idea of science which all of us inherit from various traditions. When I say we inherit it, it is taught both consciously and subconsciously, explicitly and implicitly in the way our textbooks are structured, in the way our education systems are structured. Although we may be as science students, or even if you're not science students, the idea of what is science and what is to be scientific gets internalized in very many interesting ways. And therefore, the first target of decolonization, or first possibility of decolonization, has to engage with this question about how is an imagination of science produced for us? What is it? Where did this come from? And the question of imagination is very important because science, unlike a material object like this bottle, has to be first produced before you can understand what to do with it. With a material object, it is given to me in some sense, and the givenness of the object allows me to do things with it. What do you do with an abstract idea called science? Science is not explicitly materially given to you. It has to be first imagined on what could be called as science, and then you look at what are the kinds of possible engagement with this idea of science. So, while there are many aspects to decolonizing science, I want to just talk about two aspects of it. One is to say that to decolonize science, you have to decolonize an imagination of science, which is what is science all about, and the decolonized idea of imagination in science. And this is a very fascinating historical debate on the role of the imagination in the sciences. And I'll begin with that because it's a wonderful illustrations of what kind of work history of science does. So while most of the work, interesting work in the history and philosophy of science is on the idea of imagination in the science, in the doing of science. What kind of work does imagination play? And imagination is essential for science, just as in the everyday, not just in the everyday practices of science, but also in envisioning the nature as well as expectations of science. But the role of imagination of science is different from imagination in science. The former produces the object called science, and latter the internal workings of this object. These two domains cannot be completely independent. There is a contentious history of the role of imagination in the early period of the sciences, which follows the suspicion of imagination from philosophers like Plato. And there's a long history of this resistance to the idea that imagination is in some sense a negative trait of human beings. And therefore, when you develop other kinds of categories like reason and rationality and logic, in the historical sense, you will see how they're often counterposed against the idea of the imagination. A very well-known historian of science, Laurent Daston, points out that in 1870, when the physicist John Tyndall delivered a talk titled On the Scientific Use of the Imagination, even the Times in London took strong objection to it, saying, why are scientists now beginning to invoke the idea of the imagination? Because to them, this reaction was based already on the established image of science, which is that it was based on meticulous observation and experiment rather than imagination. And an influential image of the scientist was that of the scientist as an accountant who kept books very carefully, who did not interpret numbers in the books. I mean, even today, if you talk about some of the scams of account, how people have played around, you would say that they have very imaginatively interpreted the debit and the credit account. The imaginative interpretation of facts is one of the most important problems confronting the possibility of imagination in the sciences. So imagination seems to be counter to facts, since facts could be distorted by the act of imagination. Daston argues that it was in the mid-17th century that new ideals and practices of objectivity, quote, new ideals and practice of objectivity, impacted the way the scientists understood their own practices. In particular, the rigidity of facts became a source of fear about their own imaginations. But the relation between scientific facts and scientific imagination was already a source of discussion in the 18th century, catalyzed among other things by the attempt to understand the personae of artists in contrast to scientists. And this is a very interesting long debate about what differentiates the role of the imagination within science, among scientists and among artists. And it is primarily, I mean, we'll see very briefly when that there's a divergence in this. The origin of the problem lies in the origin of modern science itself. The 18th century scientists, including Newton, were natural philosophers, philosophers who studied nature. And that was their designation, not scientists. The Baconian imagination of science, Francis Bacon, whose great influence on what science should be, what science could be, was largely driven by his approach to the idea of what it meant to do empirical science. What does it actually mean to do science? And Bacon had a lot of, I think, a very influential model of what science is, but also in some sense today quite problematic. The Baconian imagination of science was primarily an incipient critique of philosophy, in particular the tendency of what he called theory. So the Baconian shift comes as a first rejection of philosophy within the sciences. Because as I said, in the Western tradition, even up till Newton and a few decades post Newton, science was still seen as a function of the disciplinary function of philosophy. So it's within the department, if you like, of philosophy, was called as natural philosophy. And for Bacon, the most important progress in the possibility of science comes in the break from philosophy. Because for him, philosophy was theoretical, speculative, scholarly, without paying attention to the world around you, without observing the world around you. So in other words, he wanted to bring this question of observation and therefore experiment into the world domain of knowledge and move away from the model of what was constituted philosophical knowledge. So Bacon criticized what he saw as the inherent incapability of humans to look at facts without imposing theory on them, a problem which continues even today in various ways. That is, in other words, what his worry was that when we look at the world, we look at certain phenomena and we look at facts of the world, if you want to, various kinds of natural facts. But Baconian worry was, can we ever have the access to pure facts without being influenced by a theory that you hold? This, by the way, in contemporary philosophy of science, continues to be a very important problem. It leads to what is called the Quine-Duhem thesis and to ideas of theory-ladenness of observations. Some of you may have heard about this, particularly in the social sciences. It's very much a problem right from the theoretical hard science like physics. The idea of the theory-ladenness of observation is a claim that you cannot ever see a fact in itself, and that it is always influenced by the theoretical gaze you bring upon the facts. In other words, facts are interpreted, not perceived without any mediation. So theory functions as a mediation between our perception and what is there in the world, if you want to call facts as things, states of affairs in the world. So, but it is difficult to imagine the idea of facts without theory, since language itself is the first idea, since language itself is the first proto-theoretical element. In other words, what I'm saying is, even if you forget about holding on to your theory and seeing a fact, when you use a language to describe the world, when you use a language to describe what you think is a fact, you're already in the domain of the proto-theoretical, or the beginning of the theoretical, because your language is encoded. It is conceptually encoded. And the conceptual terms you use in a language to describe the facts already places a particular kind of theoretical gaze on the facts. And as I said, this is a problem which is so central to even something like, hard experimental physics. For example, when they looked at the first examples of the discovery of an electron through what is the cloud chamber experiment, it's an experiment where you know that there's an electron because you take a photograph and you can see the path where the electron curves, because you put your electromagnetic field and you know that the electron curves. But for those who do not possess the theory of electromagnetism, who do not know the effects of what the electromagnetic field will do to a negatively charged object, there is no way you will interpret that particular curve, that particular photograph, as a mark of the presence of an electron. In other words, higher sciences are always theoretically infused. It's quite impossible to understand the quantum world, for example, or the instrumental world of science without recognizing that there are some theoretical mediation which makes what it is. A similar discussion occurs around the idea of mystical experience too. Now, the real problem is that the problem is to identify what are facts, and the domain of science was seen to be the domain of facts. The idea of facts in 18th century Europe is inherited from the 17th century ideas of extracting. It's a factory, and facts have common origins, and then other terms around artifacts, factitude, etc. And the idea is that the notion of a fact is like products in a factory. It is a kind of production. It's a kind of work. And it is not just any kind of work. It's a kind of work which is very closely related to purifying. So smelting and purifying is the idea that you take the world. So the world is like the ore, the ordinary object in front of you. To extract facts from it, you have to do what you do in a factory. You smelt it, you purify it, and you pull out facts. Facts are not obviously given to us in the world, in our perception. Perceiving facts or pulling out facts from the world is an art, is a particular kind of a skill which defines what it is to do science. And those kind of facts become the foundation of science. And in the 17th century, as Daston points out, facts was actually opposed to fiction. It is not even opposed to, the other terms which comes later on. It was basically opposed to fiction. And because fiction was in the domain of imagination as conjuring up worlds that were not real, whereas facts could be observed. So the real point here is that you have the fact-imagination binary playing a very important role. That is a role of a different problem in philosophy, which is the problem of defining what is the real. So facts gave you a kind of an account of the real, whereas fiction gave you an account of the imagination. And the real problem was that fiction, the world produced by fiction, cannot be seen as the world produced by facts. And how do you justify it? How do you ground it? That's really one of the central problem in the idea of facts in the 17th, 18th century. So, as much as there was a tendency to contaminate facts with theories, so too was a fear that facts were continuously susceptible to imagination. Given the negative association with the imagination, something which is very particular to the Western tradition, especially related to the belief that madness, including of artists and poets, was related to the work of their imagination. There are some really wonderful accounts wonderful in a sense, very interesting accounts of how madness, hysteria, seizures were all related to the problems of the imagination. And that uncontrolled imagination is a kind of a very serious disease. And in a sense, it was almost that the presentation of facts, the production of facts for scientists was a way to protect them from the dangers of the imagination. Because there is a particular reason for this. The development of method, as in sciences, was seen as a protection, was as much an attempt to keep facts free from the seduction of imagination. The fundamental worry, and this was, I think, the most important worry, that the fundamental worry was that the world produced by imagination, the world of fiction, for example, would end up being seen as realities. So how do you control these limits of our, of our understanding of the world of the real? We can see this very well even in Newton's magnum opus, the greatest book, the foundational book in classical physics called Principia Mathematica. So in the first part is a very creative work by Newton where he describes the laws of motion. He analyzes the idea of the earth going around the sun. But he analyzes the idea of the earth going around the sun as a geometrical problem, not as a realist problem. For him, the earth is a geometrical point, the sun is a geometrical point, and the analysis of the earth around the sun is a problem of geometry. All the other qualities of the earth, its size, its smell, its odd shapes, do not matter in the Newtonian derivation of the theory of gravity, which is still one of the most foundational discoveries, if you like, within the science. But then after he does all this, he even gives a picture in the first section of the book where he says, imagine that the earth and the sun are tied by a string and that the earth is being whirled around the sun like as a stone at the end of a string. But then after he says all that, and then he says, oops, I'm sorry, there is really no string there. You just have to imagine it. Because he says, then he ends up by saying, all this is mathematical fiction, don't take me seriously. And he establishes the foundations of, as I said, what is motion today, the analysis of motion, the foundations of physics. And in the first part he says, this is just fiction. I'm just telling you a mathematical story and mathematical world. That mathematical imagination is just this model. And that's not the way the sun and the earth are. But it so happens that I can say this story. But by the end of the book, he converts it as if it is all real. So the very important point here for them is that I think both artists and scientists recognize that imagination is an important faculty of the human mind. And that you need imagination to be able to, sorry, I think something came. Oh, okay, I'm seeing another update message here, but you can see that here. Okay. So the growth of the theoretical discourse of the sciences, which continues to dominate the traditional models of science, has to overcome this constant fear that theory as a product of imagination becomes uncontrollable as far as facts are concerned. And this is, I think, the source of the fundamental problem even today in science. The tension between the theoretical and the empirical. Theoretical is a domain of imagination. It produces worlds which are not real, which are not conceivably. For example, one of the biggest developments in physics, contemporary physics today is, I'm sure many of you have heard about string theory, superstring theory, and so on. String theory is a theory of the world in multiple dimensions, not in 3+1 dimension. There are 10-dimensional string theory, 20, whatever, different kinds of dimensions of string theory. None of it you would think that this is like really science fiction. But it is one of the most highest valued physics subdiscipline which is present. Some of the most famous physicists in the pecking order of physicists are string theorists. But the world it is talking about has absolutely no connection to the world that we think we perceive. And yet, this is a very important tension, that theory left to itself has this propensity for blowing up, for being really imaginative. For really being imaginative. On the other hand, what regulates a theory will be facts. So, the way to think of the imaginative space in theory is then regulated. So you have to think about imagination. So you accept the fact that imagination is necessary for doing science, but then you find your way out by saying imagination should be regulated through logic and mathematics. And that's why the theoretical is always mathematical. It's not a story. So string theory is a story of very, very complex mathematics. But somehow the belief is that mathematics produces this imaginative world which is ultimately real and which can be experimentally accessible later on. But remember that's part of the mainstream disciplines of physics that we see today. As Daston shows, the 18th century approach to imagination was more ambiguous with respect to science because of this problem that theory was already beginning to play a very important role. So the acceptation of imagination with the sciences went in hand with attempts to control it, since imagination, even in the arts, was seen to have two poles of creative and healthy as against pathology. The regulation of imagination in the sciences needed first a regulation of nature, since nature could act as a delimiter to human imagination. And it is not an accident that one of the most important developments during this period is the creation of a concept of nature which is called laws of nature, which gave authority to nature as a final arbiter of facts. This is such an interesting topic, and there's much of work in philosophy of science on this. The idea that eventually, if you want to regulate human imagination, the suspicion that we can think of all terrible imaginary worlds which are all wrong, but science needs imagination, because without imagination what you have is perception. Even our simple act of perception needs an act of imagination to illuminate it, to enliven the world. And if that is the case, what should we really accept as being real? So so the imagination therefore has to become legitimate in the sciences, because without imagination there is no possibility of scientific knowledge. And it is only under the influence of Kant, Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, German philosopher who's seen as the father of the Enlightenment and of early modern philosophy, Western philosophy. That was the influence of Kant which makes a distinction between scientific imagination and artistic imagination in a very interesting way. Kant's work was very much influenced by Newton. In fact, Kant is actually a scientist. His first work, if I recollect right, is on astrophysics. And then he writes his monumental book on the Critique, the 3 volumes of the Critique. And he is responding to Newton. His Critique of Reason is actually a response to Newton's work. He's trying to justify Newton's very imaginative work in physics through philosophical categories. And in doing so, of course, there's a lot of other reasons around it, but he makes a very interesting point about the idea of imagination vis-a-vis art and that of science. And he points out, he talks about the category of genius, and where he says, that Newton is not a genius. No great mathematician and scientist is a genius, just like as geniuses are present in art. And why does he say that? He says that because it is not about nature of Newton's work, but because it's about the nature of scientific imagination, since all science by definition was communicable and could be understood by others. In other words, what Kant's point is that genius cannot be transmitted and understandable and communicable. And this is the very important shift in our understanding of science as something which is objective, something which can be transmitted, which somebody else can use and test and recheck whether they are right or wrong. Whereas artistic genius does not allow that space. And this definition of science as objective, following Kant in a few years after Kant, from between post 1820s, 1830s, is the first time in which dictionaries start coining the binary between subjective and objective, because objective now becomes the terminology which captures something about the communicability. What they mean by objective here is a very different meaning. It means that which is communicable, which others can understand, etc. Okay, so so there was this idea that science could be saved from imagination, and so we must recognize, that the discourse of the imagination of the sciences is deeply influenced. Is it coming there? Okay, was deeply influenced by the philosophical traditions of Europe, starting from the Greeks. Much of the suspicion towards imagination was based on a history of distrust towards the function of imagination. And later on, when looking at the idea of imagination in science, imagination gets legitimized in science by some work. For example, the work of Holton, who talks about Gerald Holton, very well-known work in history of science, who talked about different types of imagination present in science. So, for example, he points out there's a visual imagination, the thematic imagination, analogical imagination, and so on. And he looks at very many examples of showing how the function of imagination in all of this is cognitive. It is not pathological. So it's still not like the artistic. It is a regulated, disciplined function of imagination within the sciences, which produces these different types of training. One of his famous examples is about Galileo and the fact that Galileo discovered what he did, not because he saw something through a telescope. There was another British scientist who had also at the same time recorded what he saw from the moon. But the difference was Galileo could interpret, whereas the other person could not interpret. And why did Galileo have the interpret? For example, this is about craters. It's actually about shadows. Seeing, if we look at the moon, you see that kind of a shadow region. And Galileo was able to interpret correctly about craters in the moon because he was trained as an artist. He was trained in visualization. He used to teach perspectives. So he understood what he was seeing was the kind of shadow formations. And then after he presents his argument, the British scientist accepts it, begins to say, oh yeah, that makes sense. And this is what I mean when I say objectivity is something which is grounded not because there's a crater, but which we can come to a common understanding by showing that, look, you too can see this, and this is what sorry. So so there are now many different kinds of imagination that we talk about in science today, but all of these are really about, I don't know how much of these are like, it's really not about these other functions of imagination like in the arts, but still controlled, disciplined set of cognitive functions of imagination. But each of these kinds of imagination are in principle open to decoloniality, in the sense of how we can look at alternate perceptions of it. So in a sense of, I want to use a decolonial is just to say that you want to look at alternate ways of framing these same conceptual questions. The other point which is very important to remember here before I move to the imagination of science is the fact that we use the word science in many terms as if it is science of Newton's time or Galileo's time. Science has radically changed. And the question of imagination in science is also completely different. There are very many different kinds of questions today to science. You cannot ask the same questions about science and ask, is that what science really was? For example, it's no longer about uncovering truths of nature. It is not about the Newtonian project. Yeah, so I would say that today the idea of science as something which is exploratory of nature, discovering the reality of nature has completely changed. Today, the major part of scientific knowledge which is produced, I would say maybe about 60 to 70% of funding for science does not come from this kind of looking at the world, discovering the secrets of nature or the laws of nature and patterns of the universe. Rather, it's driven by completely, industrial complexes of the pharma, the chemical industry, the defense sector, the computer sectors, and the artificial intelligence and digital world. And therefore, some of the earlier ideas of what is science, what is it that science is imagining, etc., have radically changed. The structure of science has also fundamentally changed. It has moved away from the analytical understanding of science in terms of models, in terms of unified picture of the world and phenomena, into more calculative, computative, algorithmic models of science. So visualization plays such an important part in contemporary science today that you could, I think when we did physics, for example, as grad students, you had to know some maths, you had to solve differential equations and so on. Today, for so many students, they're all available in computer labs. I mean, you have software to do that, and you don't need to really know the nitty-gritty of solving some of those kinds of problems. So it has changed the imagination of science itself. And for the Decolonial project, it's the imagination of science which is the greatest difficulty. So in the imagination of science, the biggest obstacle to acknowledging diverse knowledge systems is based on an exclusionary definition of science. And this is really the problem. When does tribal knowledge system become scientific knowledge? Should they be considered as knowledge systems, and so on? More worrying is the resistance to take seriously the knowledge claims of many practices across the world. These practices are supported by centuries of empirical learning and are based on a conceptual vocabulary that is different from that of European cultures. So the dismissal of them as valid knowledge, remember that the definition of science is nothing but knowledge, nothing else. The idea that the dismissal of them as valid knowledge really drives the decolonial project. Now, where does the imagination of science in Western thought come from? Or if you want to call modern science, where does it come from? In modern science, the idea that what science is in European history is deeply related to philosophy. The imagination of what science is nothing but the imagination of philosophy and the limitations of philosophy. Because as I said, including the founder, as people refer to Newton as a founder of classical physics, for example, is still seen as a natural philosopher. Some of the most important people, including Galileo and Descartes, they were all from the philosophical tradition. And it is therefore, the first idea of science, the imagination of science, is influenced by that philosophical trajectory and the breaking away from philosophy, because philosophy was not empirical enough. It did not observe and experiment enough. It just wrote about what it did by just looking at books. So, thus the imagination of science is linked to that of Greek and European philosophy. The breakup between philosophy and the sciences around the idea of empirical knowledge did not change the imagination of science as much as it changed the imagination in science. The ultimate goal of philosophy, which is borrowed by science, lies in its attempt to universalize, explain, detect larger patterns, and so on. And all of that become functions of what you think science is. So scientific imagination is driven by that. So in other words, the philosophical imagination of the Greeks, who are the artificial inheritors, who are the artificial forefathers of European thought, and that's a very different story behind it, actually influence what it is to be science, why you should universalize, why you're looking for larger patterns and so on. There's nothing obvious and scientific about what science should be. If you look at philosophy, the definition of what philosophy is across the world, like Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, in most of those philosophies, the purpose of philosophy, actually very interestingly, is not about producing universal, abstract, those kind of knowledge systems. The idea of philosophical knowledge is one that is supposed to alleviate, reduce human suffering. In various ways, it is certain traditions talk about bringing happiness and contentment to humans as a function of knowledge and philosophy. In others, it is about finding the source of what we are and our life in the world and so on. So the fact that there are alternate imaginations of philosophy already indicate to us that there could be alternate imaginations of science too. Now, there's another very deep paradox when European science shifts into, moves away from philosophy to science. And this is the presence of the mathematical as an essential component of the scientific. This has been a great mystery. In fact, scientists post Galileo to Newton to Einstein to Feynman have all remarked on what has been called by another Nobel Prize winner called Eugene Wigner, who calls it the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. And he calls it unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics by he's basically asking the question, why should mathematics matter to the sciences? Sciences is about the empirical world, the physical contingent world. Mathematics is about objects which are not like the physical world. They are necessary facts. They are necessary truths, not contingent empirical truths. So why should mathematics be the foundation of science? Why the belief that without mathematics you cannot have science? And if we think that mathematics is not really the foundation for the social sciences, for example, everything that you do in quantitative methods in sociology or social sciences and anthropology are reduced to this particular idea of mathematics. So why this? So this puzzle was very deeply continues even today. But the origin of it is philosophy, not the sciences. The reason why Galileo begins this fascination, this rule that to be a science is to be mathematical, is because Galileo shifts to mathematics the idea that mathematics is the language of nature. And he has a very nice, simple picture of a scientist. A scientist is one who reads the nature. And nature is an open book written in the language of mathematics. So if you know mathematics, you can read the truths of nature. Nature doesn't hide its truths. Unlike Bacon, to whom nature by principle hides its truth and you have to torture it. You have to extract truths from mute nature. That's the empirical. And the mathematical is that, these truths of nature are actually, mathematics is essential because the language of nature is mathematics. For the book of nature image for imagination of Galileo is driven directly from the book, the divine book. The ideas that laws of nature, which becomes the foundation of physics and modern science in the 17th, 18th century, is directly drawn from divine laws and social laws. So this very interesting imaginative, trajectory in Western thought, where it relates science to mathematics as a fundamental principle of science, actually has very deep theological roots. Because it is only in Greek thought, particularly Platonism, that you look at mathematics as something which has a complete independent existence of its own, which is eternally true and always present. In fact, even up to, not even up to Newton, even after Newton, the belief that mathematics encoded the qualities of God was so deeply held. Newton, in his response to the Principia Mathematica, which is the basic physics of physics, as I said, writes that his theory of space and time are actually the qualities of Godhead. Because that's a long tradition he inherits, where they argue that geometry captures the omnipresence quality of God and arithmetic captures the eternality of God. So the qualities of eternality and omnipresence are actually embodied in geometry and arithmetic, and the use of mathematics in the sciences as a fundamental principle actually makes it deeply theological. And this, as I said, was not just held by, in fact, Newton writes a far more controversial thing in our context. He says, the success of my physics proves the existence of God. And in the sense that he was trying to legitimize what was a new knowledge system in his time with the dominant knowledge system of his society, which was the church. So, there are all these stories about what these truths are. So where is decoloniality in all of this? One might say, well, this is how it is. These are real facts about the world, etc. But where exactly does decoloniality come into the picture? The first point, of course, is the fact that if you look at what is science based upon, we have this idea that the idea of science is not just about recognizing facts in the world. It is first lies in the imagination of the concepts which describe the world. And the most important concepts which is essential to the creation of modern science is the idea of nature. And till the origin of modern science pre-Bacon, nature was actually seen as something which shares a lot of traits with other cultural understanding of nature, which is animated, has spirits in it, various kinds of narratives about nature. The move post-Bacon was to convert nature. It's just a conceptual move. It is not based on empirical evidence or something like that. And this is the function of how you produce a science. To change the story of nature as something which is mute, which holds secrets which it does not tell you very easily until you extract it, and eventually is the task of science therefore becomes an interrogation of nature, or to use Bacon's terms, make nature submissive to the scientist. And that act is a particular imagination of nature. It is not about whether nature was empirically discovered to be in that manner scientifically in any sense of the term. Similarly, we have various other elements within the sciences like idea of logic, evidence, theory, etc., which all of which have all of which are formulated in a particular way within this what we call as the Greek European tradition of science. And as I said, if you have different imagination of knowledge itself, then definitely the kind of science you are able to envision with a different theory of nature. So in other words, if the idea of scientific knowledge that we have is dependent upon the idea of nature which we construct, in other words, drawing upon geographers like Castry, I often like to say this it sounds like a nice slogan, and I think it's largely true, that there is nothing natural about nature. Everything that we talk about nature is absolutely constructed in a very specific manner. And therefore, the science which uses a particular form of nature can only be a particular form of science. If you had a science which is based on a different understanding of nature, then the question is, what kind of knowledge systems would you produce? So, as I said, there are various ways of engaging with it to greater detail, but I just want to set out the large contours of why a kind of a decolonial science is even worth thinking about. Very quickly, I'm just going to skip through this because I would like to try and finish in 5-10 minutes, is the fact that along with this question of science, why then talk so much about science when we're talking about decoloniality? What does colonialism have to do with science? And here is a very difficult story to digest. The fact is that the development of modern science in Europe went hand in hand with the imagination of colonialism. In other words, both in terms of its practical uses and in terms of its conceptual structures, it is the imagination of nature, the imagination of science, which drives the first imagination of colonialism in the way we see it in the context of European colonialism. And therefore, again, this is not about a critique of science as such, but it's to understand a historical process. So, in what sense does it drive, colonial imagination? One of the very important parallels that we see in the writings of this time is that once you define nature as mute and submissive and meant for the purposes of human beings, which drives the complete definition of nature from that time onwards, which leads to various kinds of technologies of exploitation, nature as resource for human beings, etc. So too is the imagination of other cultures. So other cultures and people become, they are mute, they are submissive, and they have to be utilized for whatever purposes. And whenever we talk about colonialism, it's always a problem because on the one hand, these reflections are written about and become very important aspect of colonial literature, how the colonizers wrote about the colonized. For example, Mill's History of British India volume is something where you can see many of this very easily. You have early German and French writing on colonialism, which will point out to very similar kinds of talking about the others, constructing other societies. In other words, the way you construct nature, it also becomes a way by which you construct other society. And very interestingly, and this is something we have to make sense of, that the reason why the other societies, like the colonized societies, were seen to be like nature and mute and submissive was because they were denied a fundamental quality which characterizes science, which was rationality and reason. So throughout the colonial literature, you repeatedly hear that what is the problem with these cultures is they do not have the capacity for rationality and reason. And this leads to the first major influence of the development of the idea of what eventually comes to be called as race science, or the first ideas of race and how race gets legitimized. And that's actually a pretty sad story. It's a sad story because I'm saying, coming from the discipline of philosophy, and when you see how much philosophers led to the development of this idea of race and justified it and legitimized it, it becomes a very important problem, something which becomes a product of the European Enlightenment. So one example of that is, of course, comes from the complete establishment of institutions. One of the most important names at the University of Göttingen is Christopher Meiners, and he had great influence on people like Kant. He shaped the human sciences in Germany and France, and it was actually, as I mentioned earlier in my talk with other students, that even in the 18th century, the idea that philosophy and science was present in other cultures was very much part of European university systems. That apparently there were a large number of chairs in studying, Asian and African civilizations and languages and so on. There occurs a period between 1780 to 1830, which historians like Peter Park point out, are really where the shift happens, when there is a complete rejection of these other societies. And it leads to something really problematical. And it's very interesting that when Kant and Hegel, two of the most important philosophers of the modern tradition of the Enlightenment period, were actually producing completely racial theories based upon their ideas of philosophy and science. In fact, if you really look at how they problematize Africa and Asia, so the first thing which they do is that Asia and Africa are not like Europe because what they lack, which Europe has, is astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The idea that mathematics and logic are not available to the non European culture, I won't even say non-West, non-dominantly German, French, and England, Britain, that they did not possess it, led to the construction of what the race is. And it is based on Mainer's anthropology, which, by the way, Kant's very important work on anthropology. In fact, some people call Kant as the first anthropologist because based on his book on anthropology. And it is based on Mainer's division of two types of the Caucasian and Mongolian. And there are many descriptions of how you would differentiate them, what their basic structures of it, etc. But the most important point is the idea of reason and rationality, which science was entirely caught up with in the European Enlightenment, was fundamentally about, it became a tool, a demarcation tool to demarcate cultures. We gave them a principle of hierarchy between cultures, and on which the European Enlightenment becomes the most superior intellectual moral faculties. In fact, you can see why the idea of science plays such an important role in the development of this hierarchy, as Kant points out. This is another big discussion which resonates right up till 20th century German philosophers, including people like Heidegger, whose argument was that the West, the non-West or the Asian and African societies are what, they are seen as sacred societies, and they do not possess the capacity for rationality and reason and mathematics and logic. And this, so surprisingly, and this is why the decolonial project becomes important, because this influence, which influences how societies are structured, how Asian and African societies look upon the idea of knowledge and what they think as progress and development, are built from a fundamental fallacy. All that Kant and others had to do was to look at the enormous output of work across societies in Asia and Africa, to look at the amount of work which had been done on mathematics. Particularly Chinese and Indian mathematics are the foundations of European mathematics till 15th, 16th century. The transmission of that through what are called the Islamic philosophers really is the foundation of European intellectual history. And to use that as to use science. So science actually becomes a very important tool in this categorization. And therefore, of course, Berlusconi calls Kant as a founding theorist of race. And because the idea of race becomes very established. And I'm just saying this about Kant, not as a critique of Kant, but to recognize that the foundational pillar of enlightenment is built on this fundamental suspicion towards those who are not like them. And here the question of color is not as important in the context of racism. That's, although if you look at what Kant says about black people, is quite, sad to read, considering he's such an important, influential, foundational thinker of modern thought. And they reproduce it, and particularly with Hegel, who is really quite nasty about the Asian and African, particularly about India and so on. And the important point here about racism and science is that it is not that the natives or the colonized could become civilized and could learn science and could become rational. The Kantian position is, what to do. This is how they are. And that this is how they are overcomes the possibility of their attainment of this. But with Kant, of course, the problem is also with women, because he thinks the criteria of rationality, which is important for ethical judgment, is not available to women, and it has to be done through their husbands. So we need to worry about this, because these are the foundational principles of what we call as modern science. And do these, rather than saying anything more, do we want to at least I'm presenting this as one argument for why we should take decoloniality seriously. That if this is the foundation of it, and if there are other foundations, can we then do something different? Okay, I'll just end now by just trying to give a programmatic answer to what does it mean to decolonize the imagination. And I'll just, very quickly run through. It's very simple to think. First, the point is there are two things which we can do in decolonizing the imagination of science. One is to decolonize imagination itself. And ask yourself, what is the theory of imagination? Today, if you look at a book, there are so many handbooks, encyclopedias on imagination. There is so much of work on the definition of imagination in so many different philosophies in Asia and Africa. None of them are part of the textbooks or even of the encyclopedic texts on imagination. So how do you bring those ideas of imagination into our global framework? That's the first challenge. And if you look at it, there are so many interesting aspects of imagination. The history of imagination in Europe, which also led to the suspicion of imagination, this problem with facts and imagination, is not present in many of these other cultures. For example, David Schulman's wonderful work called More Than Real, which talks about the function of imagination in Indian philosophical terms. And there the idea largely is that it is imagination which makes reality possible. Imagination is not in opposition to real. It is only imagination which shines a light on the real. In other words, if you don't have imagination, you cannot even detect what the fundamental structure of reality is. And to them, that's a completely different project. And that's why Schulman calls it More Than Real. Chinese philosophy is such a fascinating structure of philosophy. Very sad that as part of the larger colonial project, it's so less of it is available to students in their own training, even in philosophy departments. Their conceptual categories are fundamentally different. One of the great conceptual categories, for example, is a heart-mind, as one term, not as two different terms, as heart and mind. And much of it has to do with notions of harmony and flow, which becomes a foundational conceptual structure of Chinese thought. And in the context of imagination, for Chinese thought, imagination is very essentially related to morality. The possibility of moral action is not coming from just pure perception alone, but it has to come from an imaginary space. And that really changes the way one understands the nature of knowledge produced through imagination. Knowledge produced through an imagination which is fundamentally moral means that knowledge will always be infused by the question of morality in that production. Right? Which is what becomes a larger problem in modern Western science, where you remove the ethical or the moral from ideas of knowledge claims. The Buddhist systems of knowledge is really fascinating. I'll just say one line about it. If you look at the Buddhist logical tradition, which is very, very rigorous, nitpicking logical tradition, they repeatedly say even the greatest logicians, the only constraint they have to have is any knowledge produced as part of the philosophical doctrine must be accompanied by questions of compassion, and that they cannot be divorced from each other. So the point is that if you look at all of this, then it gives us a framework on how to decolonize science. And that is one simple pragmatic way is to look at the basic foundational definitions of things like nature, logic, mathematics, and so on. In all these cases, by the way, the definition of nature is very different in every culture. What nature is very different. Whether nature has laws of nature, there is no culture which really looks at the idea of laws of nature, which are produced very specifically at the behest of science in Europe. And that does not occur anywhere else. And the laws of nature, by the way, is a very, very mysterious entity. You know, laws of nature, all of science is about laws, right? Laws of motion, laws of gravity, etc. And nobody knows what the laws of nature are. Does it mean nature is God who has imposed laws on how objects should behave? Who makes objects behave in the way they do? And this question, whether laws of nature governs nature, has led to a lot of very interesting philosophical discussions because it's almost like as if nature has control over how objects will behave with each other. And the question is then, what is the definition of nature? How do you even know, how do you define what nature is? Similarly, logic. There is an enormous amount of work on Indian logic, Chinese logic, etc., which are in principle quite different. There are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of very fundamental differences conceptually and philosophically with Aristotelian syllogisms and what follows within what is called Greek logic. So one of the most important challenges, and this is across the world, and this we have to recognize. Here you have cultures like in India and China, which had produced enormous amount of mathematics, which finds its way into Europe till the 16th century, which then is part of the development of modern mathematics as we see today. And yet they do not believe that mathematical entities are an independent reality like Platonism. For them, mathematics for Western philosophy is distinguished from all other philosophies. Greek philosophy, is distinguished because of its belief that mathematics is the model for philosophy. That philosophy should aspire to knowledge which is as certain and true as mathematics is. And for them, for example, in the many Indian philosophical traditions, it's language which is the model, not mathematics. Mathematics, which is seen as such an important role in Western thought, you make mathematical entities theological, like God-like. They are non-spatio-temporal beings. They exist. The truth of mathematics is because of the existence of mathematical entities. This is one of the most fundamental truths which are the foundation of modern science today. Okay, Roger Penrose, a few years back when he wrote his book on the Emperor's Mind, talks about Platonism and says without Platonism you cannot understand science. What does it mean? Without accepting that mathematical entities have an independent reality of their own, but they are not like these objects, they are not concrete, they are non-spatio-temporal beings. There is no possibility of scientific truths. What is interesting is none of the other cultures ever looked at mathematics in this manner, and they looked at mathematics always as pragmatic human action. It was about counting, building, breaking, all those things which defined the nature of mathematics, and yet they did all the mathematics which becomes a hallmark of early Western science. So that is a different option. That is a different coloniality, different kind of a knowledge system which one can engage with, which is very different from this. So similarly, nature, how is nature understood in other cultures? Just to give you a very brief, quick differences. It's inanimate versus animate, mundane versus sacred, which is a very big problem throughout, especially it arises in decolonial literature very often. Control versus coexistence, demand versus permission, other versus self, and so on. So there are so many such binaries which distinguish the way nature is conceptualized in other cultures versus the nature in the culture of science. Similarly, about logic, there are very many interesting differences. More important about medical knowledge itself. Medical knowledge is no longer just about saying, oh, that knowledge, is it valid, is it not valid, etc. It arises from the recognition that the theory of the human body, the theory of health and illness are different. It is not that the medicines are different. It is not that the notions of evidence and formation of those medicines are different. It is that you start with a fundamental different theory of the body and a different definition of what it means to be healthy. Once you have that, what knowledge you produce depends upon that. You can't then say they are not producing the knowledge that a biological model of the body produces. Biological model of the body is a reductive picture of the body which many of these medical traditions don't accept. We may eventually take a decision. We may take a thing like, no, we agree that this biological is the right model, whatever. But all I'm saying is that examination has not yet happened. That critique has not yet happened. Once we do that, we will say this we reject, this we accept, etc. in an open, democratic manner. That is really the call of decolonization. It's really much less to do about other kinds of issues. And finally, and I'll just end with this, that similarly, the conceptualization of society, what is a society? What should progress be? What should we all live like? How should we live our lives? Those again depend on cultural knowledge systems, on how they imagine the idea of society, other people, friendship, kinship, and so on. And what kind of, whose ideas of society, friendship, individuality, or the idea of individuals should be accepted or should be put into debate with each other. And that's the important point. We may end up with a very hybrid model of taking some very important aspects of individuality and ideas from Enlightenment, of modern European Enlightenment and other cultural ideas. But we are nowhere close to even looking at them. You need to look at them with respect and say, well, maybe they have something meaningful, and then I'll agree and disagree and we'll see what we can do with it together, rather than a whole-scale rejection of these ideas. So finally, the last point in our own pragmatic work, in our own pragmatic question is, it's a very simple sociological question. What does the decoloniality actually imply? And it basically implies whose work do we read, cite, and expand in all our academic work. Who are the people who are producing our basic systems of knowledge which we reproduce and which we build upon? Where are these coming from? When you have a whole world of 90% of the other world other than the dominant European, American, British, Australian nexus, the Anglo nexus, all of them depending upon literature produced in these countries in order to reflect upon knowledge of their societies, then you have to ask the question, how deep is this invisible colonization process gone that they have lost the confidence to produce the kind of knowledge systems and theoretical ideas and reflective space in an academic domain in these different places. And so perhaps a simple way in which one can practice decoloniality, especially in very important institutions like yours, is to just say, where are the people who are writing about what? Where are they writing about it? How do we circulate it? Just like the work of all of the work in Europe is circulated in other countries in the world. In other words, I often ask about decolonization. The point is not whether these people knew something or whether they're good or not, but ask a simple question, whether those thinkers matter to your students, just as much as your thinkers matter to our students in order to learn whatever they want to learn. To their worldviews, their conceptualizations, their imagination, will it matter to people sitting in Delft? If so, what does it actually mean? What is the way in which we proceed with it? So that really, fundamentally, therefore, for me, the decolonial question really comes down to a simple question which we keep asking: who controls the meaning of science and knowledge? And when people might say, why do everybody of you want to keep calling your system as science? Don't need to call it as science. That's perfectly fine. In fact, for example, in the Asian context, I can tell you that the whole debate on whether something is a science or not is only a debate among English-speaking academic community. People who write in their own languages, like in Hindi or Kannada or whatever, never refer to this problem. Because they are not, the problem is, if I use the word science in talking about, let's say, a medical system or a logic system in India, then immediately I have critique from outside the country saying, no, why are you calling it science? That's not science. Science is very special to European thought. But if I don't use the word science and I may use other kinds of terms like pramana or whatever, then there is really no, it's an English language globalization which has really caused this other kind of a problem. So there are all these other kinds of levels to it, but I want to end with just by asking, who has knowledge? What should I understand knowledge as? And what is a knowledge of purpose in our imagination of the future, which all of us have to produce together? Thank you.